When we play games, the narrative and the mechanics of the game are things we can never ignore. But we often do not critically think about them as we play, or how they interact with each other. For this research project, I'm going to be looking at this interaction, but more specifically, the ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative dissonance is the conflict between a video game's story and mechanics, and what kind of narrative is delivered through those two mediums. To understand this dissonance and how it can affect the reception and outlook of a game, I'm going to be looking at two games, Persona 5 and Breath of the Wild. Persona 5 is a JRPG that follows a group of teens as they struggle against unfair circumstances that they have been dealt by society. The story focuses on the group freeing themselves from the constraints of society through the means of their rebellious natures, being personified into otherworldly personas. The mechanics of the game are done in classic RPG fashion, with very hard locks on what you can and cannot do based on the time of day and where you are in the story. This leads to a very large disconnect between the narratives provided by the mechanics of the game and the narrative provided by the actual story and writing of the game. This dissonance is what I'm wanting to investigate. Despite the fact that the story is focused on the idea of breaking societal chains, the game itself enforces its own chains on the player. Because they are game mechanics, they are not always seen as a form of narrative. These mechanics do have a large impact on the game overall, as they can greatly change the perception of the story. I want to look at this dissonance and how it compares to dissonance in other games. In Persona 5, the dissonance is loud and clear, with a stark contrast between the mechanics and the story. Now look at Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, there is a limited amount of narrative, but it is very clear what your goals are. You must take down Ganon and save Hyrule. But there is a very large amount of emphasis in the writing about how large and empty Hyrule is. Dialogue in the game allows you to see a little into the past, how busy and full of people Hyrule used to be. This makes Hyrule seem that much emptier and more spacious now. While the missions you are given have clear end goals, there's never a time you are told you must do anything. Compare this to the gameplay. You are completely free in a wide open Hyrule, free to go anywhere and everywhere, only limited by your imagination. There are very few things that are blocked by a wall you cannot pass, or can't overcome with a little climbing or gliding. Here, you see very little dissonance. The whole game just screams of freedom. You can even do crazy stuff like this, which a lot of speedrunners use. For my project, I'm going to be looking in depth at the differences in the ludonarrative dissonance in both of these games. I want to look at how they relate to each other, and how the dissonance can change the perception of the two games overall.